My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and I want to welcome you to Talking Points. During the month of March, we have been focusing on women of the African diaspora. And the reason why in the month of March that we wanted to give special tribute to women from the African diaspora because March is Women's History Month. Well, let's tell all the story. Let's not just celebrate, women that we've known to that are traditional, or what we expected, or what we were taught in school. But let's include some unsung heroes. Let's see what other contributions that have been made. And that's why I endeavored to highlight women of the African diaspora. And today, in part 4, we're going to deal with a civil rights activist. She's also a journalist and also a renowned feminist. Her name is Ida B. Wells. So let's learn some things about Miss Wells today. What has she contributed? What can we learn from her contribution? How did she benefit not only America, but specifically women of color? She was born enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. Now, she was the oldest daughter of James and Lizzie Wells. During Reconstruction, her parents were active in the Republican Party. Mr. Wells was involved in the Freedmen's Aid Society and helped start Rust College. Now, Rust is a historically black liberal arts college. It is affiliated with the United Methodist Church and was one of the 10 historic black colleges and universities founded before 1869 that is still operating. Wells attended Rust College to receive her early education, but was forced to drop out. At age 16, Wells lost both parents and one of her siblings in a yellow fever outbreak. In 1882, Ida B. Wells moved with her sisters to Memphis, Tennessee to live with an aunt. Her brothers found work as carpenter apprentices. For a time, Wells continued her education at Fisk University in Nashville. Wells wrote about issues of race and politics in the South, and a number of her articles were published in black newspapers and periodicals under the moniker Lola. Wells eventually became the owner of Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, and later of the Free Speech. These were 3 newspapers and periodicals that were done at that particular time. One fateful train ride from Memphis to Nashville in 1884, Wells reached a personal turning point that resulted in her activism. After having bought a first-class train ticket, she was outraged when the train crew ordered her to move to the car for African Americans. She refused on principle. Now, here's one of the first things that we can draw from her tenaciousness, draw from her persistence, draw from her assertiveness and her stance. This event that she experienced there and the injustice that she encountered and the pushback and eventually being thrown off the train, that was a turning point that resulted in her activism. I'm saying all that to say this, that in each of our lives, if you want to be a difference maker, sometimes it might be it might mean that something happened to me that empowered me to think differently and to be an advocate on behalf of someone else, or that caused me to stand up and open up my mouth. One of the things that Ida B. Wells displayed here is what any person who desires to be a difference maker, any person who engages in activism, any person who even models the kind of discipleship that the early church modeled, or the kind of revolutionary style leadership that Jesus the Christ even modeled. They have to have courage. Without courage, no one can step to the plate. No one can move another further. We're halted no matter how bright the idea is, no matter how much I want to make a difference. If I don't have any courage, all I'm going to be doing is flapping my lips and just sitting back, and in my silence, that becomes my way of responding to some of the injustice that we see today. And we've seen a lot of injustice that has happened in the last, in our lifetime. Especially, it's been more highlighted, with all the police brutality and all the other things that have occurred, and that have occurred with African Americans and the like. With all of these things being highlighted and spotlighted, the one thing that we need to have, if we need to have a mouth to speak up. Sometimes you and I see things we don't say nothing about. In fact, a lot of the injustice that was going on, the church, on one hand, kept their mouths closed when they could have spoke about the racial injustice. They could have stepped to the plate. They could have had the courage. They could have been more vocal about some of the things that they saw. We learned from the example that Ida B. Wells displayed that what she experienced ignited her activism. And in order for her to stay true to that calling and true to herself, she had to have courage. So as Wells was forcibly removed from the train, she bit one of the men on the hand. She sued the railroad, and she won a $500 settlement in a circuit court case. The decision, however, was later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. This injustice led Wells to pick up a pen and write. So what she experienced on the train ignited her activism. And when she received this $500 settlement, and it was later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court, she then took her activism and incorporated the power of the pen. This injustice led Wells to pick up a pen and began to write. She began her anti-lynching campaign in 1892. As a result, 3 African American men, Tom Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, set up a grocery store. Now their new business drew customers away from a white-owned store in the neighborhood. And the white store owner and his supporters clashed with these 3 men on a few occasions. One night, Moss and the others guarded their store against attack and ended up shooting several of the white vandals. They were arrested and brought to jail, but they didn't have a chance to defend themselves against the charges. Why? A lynch mob took them from their cells and murdered them. Well, in the 1890s, Wells documented lynchings in the United States in articles and through her pamphlets called Southern Horrors. lynch laws in all its phases, and the Red Record, which investigated frequent claims of whites that lynchings were reserved for black criminals only. Wells exposed lynching as a barbaric practice of whites in the South. And it was designed to what? Intimidate and oppress African Americans who created economic and political competition and a subsequent threat of a loss of power for whites. A white mob destroyed her newspaper office and presses as her investigative reporting was carried nationally in black-owned newspapers. Subjected to continued threats, Wells left Memphis for Chicago. She married Ferdinand L. Barnett in 1895 and had a family while continuing her work, writing, speaking, and organizing for civil rights and the women's movement for the rest of her life. In 1893, Wells lectured abroad to drum up support for a cause among reform-minded white people. She did this. Why? Because why? You need to have allies when you have a cause. You need to enlist others that believe in your cause, especially in this particular case, because the injustices and the lynchings were done by white people against blacks. So what you needed was reform-minded white people that would what? That would lock arms with her, that would agree with her campaign, and begin to help her to leverage and get the message out. So then what? These laws, the change could actually take place. Well, in 1898, Wells brought her anti-lynching campaign to the White House, leading a protest in Washington, D.C., and calling for President William McKinley to make reforms. Wells established several civil rights organizations. In fact, in 1896, she formed the National Association of Colored Women. And Wells is also considered a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Working on behalf of all women, as part of her work with the National Equal Rights League, Wells called for President Woodrow Wilson to put an end to discriminatory hiring practices for government jobs. Wells also created the first African American kindergarten in her community and fought for women's suffrage. In 1930, she made an unsuccessful bid for the Illinois State Senate. While her work contains extensive documentation of lynchings, she was one of the first to do so. Her work is notable for its real-time reporting on the prevalent incendiary propaganda about black rape that was used to justify the practice. Wells was outspoken regarding her beliefs as a black female activist and faced regular public disapproval, sometimes from other leaders within the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. Well, what does that tell you? Just because you have a bright idea, just because you are impassioned about something, doesn't mean that other people, even sometimes close associates, will be just as impassioned as you are. The idea that I'm highlighting that is that if you're going to be, if you feel passionate about something, you have to be willing to stick to your passion regardless of the persecution. Stick to your passion regardless of the persecution. Always have, draw from the courage that we all have to begin to do exploits. If we were to borrow anything from the scriptures, we can clearly look at what Joshua faced when he had this huge task. And many times, tasks that do make a difference are much larger than us. And he had a huge task to lead the children of Israel into the promised land. Moses had just died and he was grieving along with everybody else. But the one thing that Yahweh said to Joshua in the midst of what they had just come through, in the midst of the death of Moses and in the midst of their mourning, he told him, Moses, my servant, is dead. I want you to get up from here. Just like I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you the same way. And he told him, be strong and of good courage. Even when you have a good idea, even when you begin to move forward on the passion that's within you, at a certain point, you need to draw from an inner source. You need to draw from the wells of courage to be persistent and to keep moving in the same direction. And that's what we see from Ida B. Wells. She was so passionate about this that she really highlighted, she went out and found where these lynchings were done. And as a result of that, guess what? She faced public disapproval, yet she kept on moving. She faced disapproval from other leaders in the civil rights movement, yet she kept on moving. She faced pushback even from women's suffrage movement, yet she kept right on moving. She had courage. She was a skilled and persuasive speaker. Wells traveled nationally and internationally on lecture tours. In 2020, Wells was posthumously honored with a Pulitzer Prize Special Edition, quote unquote, for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. Wells died on March 25th, 1931 from kidney disease. Well, there are a couple of quotes here as we wrap up our time today that I want to highlight. The first one by Ida B. Wells is this: one had better die fighting against injustice than to die like a dog or a rat in a trap. Her second quote here that's also famous: the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And that's exactly what she did. She turned the light of truth upon the wrongs through the power of the pen, through her gifted oratory, fueled by her tenaciousness and her courage to continue to do what she was doing in spite of all the resistance that was coming against her. Now that's what we can learn from Ida B. Wells. She set an example and model before us that we can draw from this ancestor on how to empower our activism today. Whatever your activism is, whatever you're passionate about, Ida B. Wells has set an example that we can draw from so we can continue to be the difference makers that we're destined to become. I trust you have enjoyed part 4. Next week, we're going to conclude our Women's Month highlight of the women from the African diaspora. Come back then as we wrap things up, and let's look and take away the truth, these kernels of truth, and let them really give insight and guidance as how we can be a better version of ourselves in the face of the wrongs that are out there, maybe through our own salt and light, that we can right the wrongs and turn a light of truth even upon them. We'll see you next time right here on Talking Points. God bless.